basically when people get their ballot in the mail, it's like getting a bill. And there are some people who pay their bills as soon as they get them, and there's some people who wait until the deadline. And those types of people are actually different from each other. You know, they have different behaviors, they have different experiences in voting, they may be of different parties, and that like different turnout messages work on them and different persuasion messages work on them. Hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Agner.
And we are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024. We also care deeply about pastries. Today, we are talking about early voting. We are recording this on Tuesday, October 8th. Hopefully we'll have this up and published soon. This is, as we were speaking, it is 4 weeks prior to the 2024 presidential election. And at this point, according to the latest available data, roughly 2 million Americans have already cast their votes for this election. Probably around a little bit more than 1% of all the Americans who will vote. And they've done so in approximately half of the 50 states. More early voting is coming online over the next few weeks. Colorado, which is an all mail-in state, Coloradans will be receiving their ballots at the end of this week. For what it's worth, in 2020, roughly a third of all the votes cast in the presidential race were actually cast early or absentee. Obviously, the COVID pandemic had something to do with that, but a lot of states have kept those early voting provisions. So today we're going to talk about just what we know about all this and what it means. That is, like, who actually votes early and who doesn't? What are the consequences of an election day that lasts more than a month? And, what can we learn in advance by knowing who is voting now? John, how does this sound to you?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating topic. In Minnesota, where I live, people have been voting since September 30th, which is wild to me that, when election day starts in September here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So walk us through the data a little bit, Seth, if you don't mind. What do we know about who votes early or who's voted early so far?
So I'm drawing on the data reported by the University of Florida's Election Lab, which is a really valuable resource. They've been doing this for several cycles now, just recording across all 50 states who is voting early and where, places where that information is available to be broken down by party. They will do that. The election lab, I believe the main investigators there are professors Michael McDonald and Daniel Smith in the poli-sci department. I'll post a link to it on our blog site or our Substack site. But what they have so far, again, roughly 2 million early votes cast so far. To the extent we know the party registration of people who have cast their early votes, it's been heavily favored by Democrats. I think about 58% of the early voters have been Democratic, about 26% have been Republican, only 16% have had no party affiliation. Now, just to be clear, that we have public information on the voter registration of people who've cast early ballots. We don't know how they voted. For the most part, states they're compiling this information. Some of them, they've actually recorded it on a computer, but they can't report any of it till Election Day. In other places, they literally don't count anything until Election Day. But we don't know how these people are voted. But, historically, how they're registered is a pretty good indication of how they're going to vote on Election Day. Not surprisingly, the early vote skews heavily toward older voters. Something like 60% of those who've early voted so far are over the age of 65. This is not terribly shocking. First of all, older voters are much more likely to vote, but also they're much more likely to take advantage of voting absentee or voting early, particularly for folks who prefer not to leave their home. The early vote skews a little more female, by about 52 to 44%. It skews white to some extent. But, that's what we know so far. But again, the early voting numbers are going to become a lot more prominent over the next week as a lot more states send out their ballots, particularly, the all mail-in states. One thing, just a quick comparison to 2020. Back then, it was also a similar partisan skew, I believe, of the roughly 50 million people who voted early or absentee. It was about 45% Democratic and about 30% Republican. And it's important to remember, in 2020, Donald Trump was heavily crapping on the idea of early voting, right? He was telling everyone that was the path to voter fraud, that Republicans should not do it. The Democrats were clearly breaking laws by doing it. And Republicans responded to that by they voted a lot in person. That probably hurt the party overall. It hurt Republicans. My understanding is that while Trump still insists that early voting is highly prone to fraud, he has sort of backed away from that a little bit and basically said, look, as long as Democrats are going to vote early and absentee, Republicans need to ramp that up as well. But at least so far, we're not seeing that.
I think that you're doing a little bit of sane washing on that.
No,
it's kind of hard to follow what he said exactly.
Well, yes, it's been all over the place, but I swear to God, I was at the.
He, of course, he votes early himself, yes. And so it's fine for him.
At the Republican convention, there was actually a video of Trump saying we need to be doing this too, even though he thinks it's evil. So take what you will from that, but
it's wild.
Okay. So I'd say that's sort of where we stand.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting because I learned how to do campaigns and I learned the basics of American politics back in 2004, which feels like a lifetime ago. But back then when folks talked about absentee voting, it was very much a Republican stronghold, right? That, as you said, absent male voters tend to be older and therefore for a long time trended strongly Republican. I think as more places made mail voting more common, and as in-person early voting became more common, we started to see this sort of pre-2020, a lot of times Democrats would take advantage of in-person early voting and Republicans would take advantage of the mail, and election day was sort of a toss-up. 2020 really shifted that dramatically. I think in part because Democrats took the pandemic very seriously. A lot of folks voted by mail for the first time in 2020. And it'll be really interesting to see how much of those trends continue. I know in 2022, the early vote was strongly Democratic, not as strongly as it was in 2020. I think the combination of, not having a pandemic and Republicans, as you say, at least on paper, encouraging this more, it'll be interesting to see where it winds up this time. But I think one of the dangers that I've seen already, some people starting to say, is at this time 4 years ago, Democrats were 80% of the electorate. Now they're only 60% of the electorate. That means Kamala Harris is going to lose. And I think that analysis is really dangerous and, can lead you into a lot of crazy places.
Yeah, I totally agree, because there's a lot of people who really had to vote, absentee or early in 2020, to protect their own health. Yeah. And they're just prefer to vote in person this year. Or their state has really they're not continuing with the traditions of doing voting that way. So just the voting rules are just different from how they were 4 years ago.
Yeah. And, I think you mentioned the University of Florida website. There's another place people can go look. Target Smart, which is a voter file company, has a public thing called Target Early that you can go find. And, their numbers bear this out, that 30 days before the election in 2020, there were 4.4 million votes. We're now at, 1.9 million.
Okay.
So, a much lower share of the vote so far, which I think, again, completely to be expected.
Okay, that's interesting. So we're really about half the rate we were 4 years ago.
Yeah,
that is expected. So question for you. I had once had a political consultant come speak to my students who explained early voting in Colorado, and he was saying that basically when people get their ballot in the mail, it's like getting a bill. And there are some people who pay their bills as soon as they get them, and there's some people who wait until the deadline. And those types of people are actually different from each other. You know, they have different behaviors, they have different experiences in voting, they maybe have different parties, and that like different turnout messages work on them and different persuasion messages work on them. So I actually just sort of wanted to like, toss to you, you've run
Yeah.
a number of campaigns. How does an extended multi-week voting period change things from just when election day is just one day?
I think it's such a big and complex question, and so you're going to have to stop me if I get lost in the
Okay.
confusion at this point. But I think right off the bat, there's you mentioned Colorado at the top of this, is an entirely vote by mail state. California is now almost entirely vote by mail. Arizona, Montana are both going to be heavily vote by mail. Nevada, a lot of these Western states, everybody gets a ballot either by default, or if you've ever asked for a mail ballot before, you then always get one sent to you. It's called the permanent absentee vote list. So in places where, in Ohio or in Minnesota or Pennsylvania, where you've got to go ask for your mail ballot, that's like asking for a bill that you want to be sent to your house. So when it comes to like any voter who's motivated enough to say, "Dear Secretary of State, send me a ballot," like they want to vote, they're excited about voting. When the ballot comes, they're probably going to turn it around pretty fast. When it's folks who are getting it by default, that's where you get a much wider range of responses, right? Where, again, the folks you're talking about who are really eager to fill it out right away and send it back in, people who want to take their time with it. One of the things that impacts this is how complex the ballot is, how many other things are on it. I've done a lot of research over the years. There are some kinds of voters who believe that they don't have a right to weigh in on races that they don't know a lot about. So if your ballot shows up and all of a sudden there's 30 judges that you've never heard of, or a bunch of ballot measures, or a bunch of bond measures, or some states have 2 or 3 or 4 page ballots. That can often, a voter who requested their ballot because they want to vote for Donald Trump or they want to vote for Kamala Harris, that ballot showing up and then having a lot more questions can slow folks down and can make that harder. Some folks, as I said, some voters believe that they need to do a lot of research before they can weigh in. Other voters don't. They feel like they can just do what they want to do. Weirdly enough, that is gendered. No one's going to be surprised to hear that women are much more likely to do their research and men much more likely to be like, "That's cool, I'll just skip that one." So that impacts the voting behavior quite a bit. One of the things that early voting gives a well-organized campaign is the opportunity to basically be in the voting booth with people. That it's public record who has requested an absentee ballot and when they've requested it, and then when that is mailed. So, when I was working in Ohio in particular, it's very easy to do this there. Every day you can go download a file of the people who got their absentee ballots mailed out that day. So a well-organized campaign will take the people on that list that they cross-reference it with their targets, with their persuasion targets, their turnout targets, voters who they've identified as supporters, or who they think they need to reach out to, and they can call them and say, "Hey, we just heard from the Secretary of State, your ballot's on the way. What questions do you have?" Right? So if you're running a bond campaign, if you're running a down ballot campaign that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention or have a lot of volunteers, that's your chance of saying, "I know that this is a Democratic voter, or I know this is a Republican voter, or I know this is a voter who said that they care about education." And you have the chance to communicate with them in the exact window that the ballot's going to be at their house. Which, if we could follow voters into the voting booth on election day, we would do it. So yeah, it's a real value if you've got your act together enough to be able to get that information and get it into the right people's hands every day. Because you don't have to ask yourself, is this person going to vote? We know they're going to vote. They've got the ballot. I think the other place that it benefits a well-organized campaign is that we can see who has been sent a ballot and then whose ballots have been returned. And so it gives you a chance to do what campaigns called ballot chase, which is saying, "Hey, Joe Smith, you've got a ballot on your kitchen table. We need you to fill that out and return it." Can somebody, in some states you can go to their house and pick it up. In some states you can give them a stamp. That's illegal in other states. I don't want anyone hearing this to think that I'm encouraging voter fraud. If that is illegal where you live, ask a lawyer. But campaigns can do a lot either by physically helping people return their ballots or by encouraging them to return their ballots, which again gives you the ability to sort of stretch out your get out the vote communications. Every campaign I've ever worked on in states that have early voting, your goal is to start doing get out the vote as soon as early voting is allowed, and to stretch that out and to try to encourage every single voter who you want to vote ever to vote early, because it gives you multiple bites at the apple, right? It gives you multiple chances to knock on their door, to have them pick up your phone call, to read your mail, to have all that communication. But that also means that you've got to really stretch out the way that you think about a race. That if your goal is to introduce yourself to a voter, again, particularly if you're thinking about a congressional race or a state legislative race or a ballot measure, something that's not the top of mind, like voters know who Kamala Harris is, they know who Donald Trump is, they probably don't know who their state senator is. So if campaigns are encouraging folks to vote early, you have to really back up when you think people need to learn about you. If you're starting to communicate with voters in Minnesota in October, some number of them have already cast their ballots before you even start. So what we've seen over the years is that, TV ads start running earlier, direct mail has to get sent out earlier, polling's got to get done earlier, everything has to move up because, we need to be communicating with voters from the time that they have their ballots. One thing that we know very clearly is that the voters who vote the earliest are the least persuadable, right? Like, no one who is torn between Harris and Trump is going to make that decision right now. They're going to wait longer to do it. But there are a lot of voters that are persuadable down ballot, or who are more, who don't know as much about what's happening down ballot, and those campaigns really have to change their strategy.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot of information.
That was a lot.
And I have another question for you.
I apologize. I feel like I should have had footnotes in that. Yeah.
So how does this affect campaign polling? Are people who have voted, are they as ready to provide an answer with people who are intending to vote, or how does that work?
So a lot of the reasons that people will tell you that they're voting early is to get the phone calls to stop, right? To get especially if you live in a battleground state where, every campaign is calling and blowing up your phone. Sometimes people are like, I'm voting early because I want you all to go away. And when a pollster calls, a lot of times they're less likely to answer the phone. But they also, what we found in a lot of the polling that I worked on is that voters can be less likely to tell you who they voted for, right? That people take very seriously the idea of having a secret ballot. And there are some voters who will tell you, I'm going to vote for such and such, but find it different to say, I did vote for this person. Because people value the secrecy of their ballot, as they should. It's one of the reasons that our system works as well as it does. So one of the things that I think is interesting, in part because of early vote, but also just in part because of the volume of text messages and phone calls that people are getting, polling can actually get less accurate the closer you get to an election. In the last couple cycles, the peak of accuracy of polls have been polls conducted about 2 weeks out, rather than a day or two before, in part because there's less competition for people's attention, and folks are more willing to tell you what they're going to do. I think the other place where this matters for polling, though, is the reason most people do most polls is because they're trying to formulate a strategy. You've got to back out your strategy, and it means that your opponent's tactics that they try to do in October are going to have less of an impact because more people have actually voted. I think one of the big things that early voting has done is it's reduced the impact of the October surprise, right? Like, I saw a joke on Twitter that, October surprises are now happening in September due to climate change. But there's a real point to that, right? That, once we get into October, the 2 million people who've already voted, a meteor could hit the White House tomorrow. Their vote's in the bank. They can't do anything about it. We have, you've got to think strategically. If you've got information that you want to drop, if you have oppo to hit, if you've got, a really good ad that you want to make sure the voters are seeing, you have to start thinking about when in the cycle that's going to be a little bit different.
This was, I remember hearing this, probably just a few minor cases of voters, but I remember hearing some of this in 2016 when, Jim Comey put out that report about Hillary Clinton and email use investigation at the end of October. And there were many voters, millions of people who'd already cast votes, and some of them were like more moderate people who'd cast a vote for Hillary Clinton and said, hey, is there some way I can change my vote? And they could. I mean, sure, generally speaking, those who vote early, as you pointed out, they're already pretty passionate voters. They don't have a hard time knowing who they like. The chances of something actually occurring that would cause them to change their mind about their vote is pretty low. But yeah, their vote is banked. They can't change it.
Yeah, it's definitely true that folks who vote early are less likely to be undecided at the top of the ticket. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they're not persuadable, particularly for down ballot races where there's less information and they could learn something, 2 or 3 weeks out before the election that would change what they would have done. But yeah, I think the Comey letter is a great example. Clinton, we know that moved votes. It moved lots of votes, and maybe it was blunted a little bit because of when it happened in the cycle.
So what do we know about, just knowing who has voted early so far, knowing that there's a big Democratic advantage to the early votes so far, does that offer us much prediction value? Like, does this tell us that, Democrats are clearly more enthusiastic about this election, they're more likely to prevail, or does it not really tell us much about that? I'm curious what your impression is.
It's a great question. I got paid for a long time to make early vote reports and to do deep analysis into who had voted early. So I don't want to come out and say that there is no value to this data, because I really think there is, but it's got to be taken very,
Right.
very carefully. And you need to have a tremendous amount of information about voters who are voting early. Just looking at the top line number and saying 56% of the people who have a party registration who voted are Democrats, that doesn't mean this is going to be a Democratic landslide, right? You don't have enough information there. However, if you start to see patterns of, more people who have requested their ballot who are returning it quickly are Democrats and Republicans, there might be a clue there. If you start to see something that, people who didn't vote in 2020 are now voting early and they're more likely to be Republicans, there's a clue there, right? That where things get really, where you could really start to mine some real information out of this is when you start looking at turnout patterns among people who you didn't think were going to vote. If you've got, 2 weeks before the election day, if we start seeing in Georgia that at early vote sites, we're getting a lot of sporadic voting Democrats to show up, that's a really good sign for Dems. In 2016, one of the warning signs that we had, I was in North Carolina on election day 2016, or the week run up to election day, because I was looking for a way to be useful. And one of the things that was quite clear in the data back then is that a lot of habitual Democratic early voters had not voted early yet. So people that you would have expected to show up early were not showing up. And after the election, it turns a lot of them didn't show up at all. That was a warning sign that was prevalent in the data, but you needed so much context about their previous vote history, all this information that, you've got to use it really carefully. So I think that, it's the kind of thing that it's very hard for political enthusiasts at home to follow carefully. But again, well-organized campaigns, do have the ability to learn some important information about the election.
Oh, interesting. I did, a while back, I did an analysis at 538 about basically looking at like early voting patterns in 2012 and how well those predicted the actual vote share in different states. And it was, there's a little bit of a trend, but it's not super conclusive. Basically, of the, the dozen or so states that we had data for like 2 weeks before the election, if there's more of a Democratic lean in the early vote, that tended to mean more of a Democratic lean in the actual vote share. It was mainly driven by Maryland, that had a really strong Democratic early vote, a really strong Democratic vote share. It was kind of inconclusive among the rest of the states. So that led me to think, okay, this actually doesn't tell us a whole lot about what's going to happen. There's been a few other analyses that have suggested, well, it's a little predictive, but it's not a very strong pattern unless you're like looking for specific sorts of voter behavior like you mentioned.
I think that's right. I do think that in the all male states, it is a little bit more
Sure.
instructive just because, again, it's in Oregon, in Colorado, in Montana, you can start to see patterns. But, just because someone didn't return their ballot 2 weeks out doesn't mean they're not going to. So, you've got to stay on top of that analysis
Good.
all the way through.
Okay, that makes sense.
But you mentioned this earlier. I wanted just to, have you expand on this a little bit. Um, One of the ways that early vote's going to impact this election is it does change what the results look like on election night. Do you want to explain that a little bit better?
Yeah, and to the best of my understanding, there's a number of states where they don't start counting the absentee ballots, basically, until election day. And sometimes those are actually counted later than the people who are counting the in-person voting going on election day. And so to the extent there's, a partisan lean in who has voted early, that can, that can sort of affect what it looks like as they start counting the ballots. So you might see a more Republican lean in the early vote as they're starting to tabulate ballots, because those are the people who voted in person. And then as they get around to counting the absentee ballots and the mail-in ballots, that suddenly starts to look like more of a Democratic lean. So and we've seen this pattern in a few election cycles now where, early in the night, it starts to look pretty Republican. And then as more ballots are counted over the course of the day and overnight, you start to see things trend back in the Democratic direction. That's what happened with Biden's win in 2020. Is what happened with, Democrats in the House elections in 2018 and 2022. I'm assuming we're going to see a similar pattern to that this year as well.
Yeah, I know that was really dramatic in Arizona last cycle, where the late ballots broke really strongly for Democrats.
Yes. And that's, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, one of the things that I'm worried about, given how much conspiratorial thinking there is right now. And as Seth said, this is October 8th, and we're dealing with the aftermath of the awful hurricane, and just the incredible conspiracy theories that are everywhere right now. If we think that that's bad now, a month from now, when vote shifts are starting to happen, where the absentee ballot in a Democratic county is going to break 90-10 for Harris, and people are going. I'm worried how we're gonna handle those kinds of movements in an atmosphere that's already so conspiratorial and so willing to
and we saw, Trump makes all these kind of claims like you need to stop counting at midnight on election night, which makes no sense. Everyone knows that makes no sense.
Well, it makes sense if you want Republicans to win.
But I mean, that's as I can't remember who it was that pointed out, like in the January 6th congressional investigation, just that counting the ballot it's a jigsaw puzzle. And it shouldn't matter where you start the jigsaw puzzle. It's going to look the same, once you're finished with it. And the idea that, it's just the early ones that count is absurd. But he's going to definitely float conspiracy theories about some of these states and say, when those big dumps of votes started moving things in the Democratic direction, that's clearly evidence of out-of-state fraud or criminal activity. And of course, it just means this is whose vote is getting counted at that point. And it will take a while. And the media were pretty good about this in the last election cycle, just setting the viewers up with expectations about here's how long this will likely take. Here's what here's the sort of shifting that we can expect to see over the course of the day, just to kind of take some of the surprise elements out of things. But it is important for news organizations to do that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. It makes me jealous of the British system where, they count all the votes in secret and then they announce it at the same time at 4 a.m. And you just get one number. I think their citizens end up being better informed.
So nice.
Than the sort of very messy in public that we do.
Yes.
Yeah. And also they all have to stand on stage and hear the numbers read out loud.
I love that.
I think is
I love that.
And
yes.
we should absolutely make our people do. Well, I feel like we've talked a lot about early voting. Let's get to the important stuff, which is obviously pastry. You were recently in Sweden, and I understand that you got to celebrate a very important holiday.
Yes. So here's the thing I learned in a recent trip to Sweden. So I was there actually on university business. Me and some of my colleagues from the University of Denver traveled there to Lund University in southern Sweden. where we have our university has a couple of partnerships with them. We have a number of students there. And we were going there to like check up see how this partnership is going, and also give some talks about the U.S. election, because there's a lot of people, like a lot of the students and faculty there are following this election very closely. They had a lot of good questions about it, and so we gave a couple of talks to different folks about it. But there is a couple of things. Tradition in Sweden known as fika, F-I-K-A, which is simply a sort of coffee and pastry time roughly twice a day. And it is something that, as far as I could tell, the Swedes take very seriously. They were quite, they were quite adherent to this tradition that around 11 a.m., people take a break from work and they get coffee and they have some sort of a pastry, usually a sweet one. Then they might do the same thing around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, maybe get more of a savory pastry and a cup of coffee. It's kind of a communal moment, in the political science department where I was. People actually gather around. They have these really nice coffee machines, and people just gather and talk and eat a pastry or have some rye bread or something like that. It was nice, actually. I love seeing that sort of like regimented break time and pastry time. And on top of that, like the main pastries we had there, the popular ones there are cardamom buns called Kanelbullens, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and then cinnamon buns, which are Kanelbullens. They were, first of all, the cardamom buns are really good, and they're not too sweet and not too spicy. I don't know how they do it, but they're delicious. And the cinnamon buns are great, and they're not like overtly sweet and sticky like American cinnamon buns are.
Yeah, they're not like covered in icing. Right?
Okay, well, for the most part, no. However, last Friday when we were there, it was actually a Kanelbullens holiday. They actually do a cinnamon bun, an annual cinnamon bun holiday. It seemed like everyone sort of agreed this is a fake holiday, but of course all holidays are. But it's just a day of celebration of the cinnamon bun, and all the bakeries in the area just really stock up on extra cinnamon buns. They have different variations of them. The one where we went had the sort of traditional version. They had some with different fillings, and they had the kind of American style ones with a bunch of frosting slathered on top. So like you did have some options there, and it was great, and it was a lovely tradition.
I think that we could unite the country around replacing Columbus Day with Cinnamon Bun Day, and I think that maybe that should be our next project.
100%.
Well, if you ever come visit in Minneapolis, we have the American Swedish Institute is here, and the cafe in the lobby is called Fika, and they keep that tradition alive. So
let's do it.
Come to Minneapolis and we'll Fika.
Let's do it. Okay.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. This has been really helpful. I hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you for listening to us today. We hope to have a new episode up for you soon. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flower. This episode was produced by Eli Masket. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.